Hi everybody. In this video, I'm going to show how language is all throughout the standards, regardless of the grade level and regardless of the subject matter. So I've pulled samples of the standards from every grade, kindergarten through fifth grade, and from every subject area, ELA, math, science, and social studies. And I've just highlighted some samples of where language is. I think sometimes when we say the word language, it can be confusing. It's kind of broad and vague. So I wanted to show you some specific examples of where language is embedded in the standards. I hope this will help when we're back in school and you're working with students and you start to maybe realize that children might be having difficulty. If you notice that they're having difficulty with some of these highlighted areas, that may be an indication that it's language-based difficulty and maybe they need a screening and some interventions. So I know the information is a little dry, so I'll try to have some brain breaks to break it up now and then, just not so that it's not quite so boring. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first one I pulled up was a kindergarten ELA language standard. So kindergartners have to ask and answer questions. Starts in kindergarten and goes throughout for the rest of our lives. And this is something that we often work with students in speech and language. We start out with teaching them to answer what questions, and then where, and when, and who, and why. And we build that skill to the point that they're listening to paragraphs and answering questions. So whenever you see ask and answer questions, that's always a language skill. Retelling, describing connections, finding unknown words and trying to figure out the meanings, those are all language skills. We work on sequencing in speech and language, and that goes with retelling. We work on transition words, and that goes with retelling. We work on main ideas and details, and all of that goes with retelling. Also, with unknown words, vocabulary is a huge part of what we do. We don't really teach content vocabulary, so we wouldn't be teaching science or social studies vocabulary, for example, but we're teaching the underlying concepts of vocabulary, such as antonyms, synonyms, multiple meanings. How do you define a word? So all of that starts in kindergarten and goes through all of the grade levels. And then describing relationships. This is something that if children don't get this at an early age and really begin to build on it as they get older, it's very difficult to establish this skill if you don't work on it until fourth or fifth grade. This is one of the areas that we test kids in. And if they can't see relationships among words and ideas and information, they really start to struggle, especially as they get in the upper grades. So it's important that we start early. Okay, let's take just a little quick brain break. And here's a little meme for you. Can you describe the relationship between this illustration and the story? I think we can all relate to that. Okay, back to our language. So now I pulled up some first grade math language concepts. Math is a great area to apply language concepts. So comparing is the first one that I've highlighted. We have to know how to compare and contrast information. And in math, you need to know how to compare lengths and heights and widths and weights and sizes. So that's a language built right into math, a language concept built into math. Organizing, representing, interpreting, categorizing, all of those are important language concepts, and you can work on that while you're in the math class. Again, we have answering and asking questions that we just talked about with English language arts. How many is a type of question. Distinguishing, you have to be able to see the differences and the similarities, and attributes also goes along with describing. So we don't often think of math as being language based unless it's a word problem. We do think of it when it's a word problem, but it's not just word problems. All of our language tasks require us to use language. So that's an example from math. I'll give you a real quick little brain break. Oop, wrong one. And that is definitely me. Okay, let's go back to second grade science. I was really shocked at how complicated the science and social studies standards are. They're very heavy standards that require a lot of complex language application. So, right off the bat, it asks you to evaluate and communicate. In order to evaluate something, you have to observe it, you have to be able to describe it, you have to be able to compare and contrast your descriptions, organize those descriptions, categorize those descriptions, make judgments about those descriptions. Those are all language based skills. So, right off the bat, the very beginning of this standard requires a lot of background language knowledge and skill level. And then once you have all of that information, you have to be able to communicate it to someone else expressively, expressive language. You have to be able to communicate it to someone else. Again, asking questions, describing, which also goes along with attributes. When you talk about attributes, you are describing. And then constructing an argument. Again, that's a very high level language skill to construct an argument. So in science, in social studies, which we'll see in a second, what I see is a lot of complex, higher level language skills that the children have to be able to put on top of the information that the teacher is teaching them. They have to use these language skills and apply it to whatever it is that they're learning in science, whether it be about the solar system or about organisms, whatever it's about, they have to have these language skills and apply it down into the information their teacher is teaching. So it was really complicated. I was kind of shocked about that. Okay, now we're going to go on to something that kind of seems no-brainer. It's third grade English language arts, and it's language. And so every grade level will have this language. And so you automatically think, well, of course, that's what speech and language therapists do. But actually, it's not necessarily. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. Let me give you a quick brain break. Okay, I can't resist babies laughing. Okay, so this first one talks about conventions. And that's a really tricky area because you're talking about standard American English, which is a dialect. And we do not, if a child speaks a different dialect other than standard American English, that doesn't mean they have a disability. So I'm going to do a whole nother video on that. But this conventions of standard English, sometimes we work on it and sometimes we don't. It depends on the child and it depends on specifically what their issues are. So watch another video that I'm going to have on dialect to understand these conventions, but we don't necessarily work on this with children. And then we have this one right here where it talks about conventions and mechanics. That's really not something that we work on either. We don't work on spelling usually or capitalization, punctuation. That's not something we would usually work on, even though it's under the language standard area. That's really not what we typically do in speech and language impaired. But now, this one, the knowledge of language, the vocabulary acquisition and use, yes. Almost anything you could pull out of here is what we do in speech and language. When kids are having difficulty with these issues, that often can mean that they have a speech and language issue and something that we might need to address as well. So you see that they talk about the knowledge of language, speaking, reading, listening, writing, words and phrases, meanings and multiple meanings, using context clues, using language strategies, identifying root words, suffixes, prefixes, word relationships, nuances. All of these things are things that we work with in speech and language. These are heavy language issues. So I thought it was very interesting to note that under this big category of language, there are some areas that it's not really what we do in speech and language. So I'll talk more about the dialect in another video. We don't really work a lot with conventions and mechanics, but we do work a lot with this knowledge of language, vocabulary acquisition, and use. So if you have a child that's having difficulty with those areas, That might be something to keep in mind. They might need some MTSS and see if they might need an evaluation in speech and language. Okay, I'm going to go on down to fourth grade social studies. And again, it's just like science, it's heavy with complex language skills, describing, discussing, and explaining really complicated information. So the teacher is here to teach the information about the wars and the people throughout history and issues that we've dealt with. That's what the teacher's teaching, and the kid needs to apply all of this language information to it. So if the child doesn't have this language base and the teacher's teaching these concepts, there's just going to the concepts are just going to fall because they don't really have anything to hold them up. And remember the little Legos that I showed you in the other video. The kids have to have a really strong language foundation in order for the teacher to be able to put that content information on top of so that the kids can use it. So science and social studies, kudos, you have a really tough job to teach the kids the content and then hope that they have the language abilities and the language basis to use that information. Okay, now we have another big area that we use a lot in speech and language, and that's speaking and listening, comprehension and collaboration, presentation of knowledge and ideas. This is just exactly what we do. But the thing is, these standards talk in big, broad terms, and we break it down into very small, little terms. So collaborative discussions, we have to work on very small skills, such as using eye contact. How do you listen? How do you show someone that you're listening? How do you make sure that you understood what they said? How do you compile all of your information into an idea and then express it to the other person? So, all of these issues, all of these language areas are things that we work with, but we break them down into very small skills in order to help the child build up into these broader skills. So, I hope that was helpful in seeing how language is all throughout the standards in every grade level and in every subject. Um, and if you have any questions about this or want me to elaborate further, just feel free to give me an email. So I'm going to end it with a really fun brain break so you can stop watching here, or you can watch some of this. You may have already seen it on the internet, but it's awesome. So I'm just going to stop here and let this play.